So basically, truthful is about game theory, right? Truthful is about the fact that people are lying all the fucking time. And okay, we're actually going to say a little bit more about that one before we move on. When you're playing poker, you learn how to bluff, because it's not who has the best hand that wins. It's who makes everyone else think that they have the best hand, and right, there's a lot that goes on in that. And so because it's a zero-sum game, right, that if my win does not equal your win, my win is going to equal some other player's losses, then I have an incentive to disinform you, where information about reality is a source of competitive advantage. This is actually the real kind of key way of thinking about it, because disinformation even happens in nature with other animals. Right? You'll see a caterpillar that evolved to have something on its tail that looks like a head to disinform birds so that they go to peck at the false head and it might still be able to live, right? Like that's actually an evolved disinformation strategy. And it's just that the disinformation in nature happens very slowly, and where the selective pressures on the side of the caterpillar and the bird are co-evolving, right? So the bird is getting better at noticing those things as the caterpillar is getting better at dealing with that. Camouflage is a kind of disinformation, right? It's an attempt to not signal something fully, because there's rivalrous dynamics between the caterpillar and the bird in that scenario. But with people, with our abstract replicators, we can create the distortion much, much, much faster. We can have asymmetries in the capacity to create the distortion, and even exponential asymmetries. And so it's actually really quite different. So you think about the poker bluff, and you think about, like, even in soccer or football, when someone fakes left and then goes right, that's a disinformation strategy, where if we're competing and information about the nature of reality, where the water is, where the gold is, what the market is going to do next, if this company is going to make it, whatever, equals a source of advantage, but we're an assumed rivalrous dynamic, we're competing for the same money, competing for the same attention, whatever, then first I have the incentive to withhold information, right? So I don't want to tell you where the gold is, or I don't want you to know the intellectual property that I'm going to monetize. Simply the withholding of information fucks up the information ecology so much, because I'm doing cancer research and I've had some big breakthroughs, but I'm not trying to share that with everyone else who's doing cancer research, because this is being funded by a for-profit process that needs to be able to monetize that through intellectual property, right? And so we can see how much problem happens as a result of withholding of information, but we can also see how intractable this problem seems within a game theoretic environment like capitalism, right? I keep saying capitalism. I'm not going to say that any other bad economic system we've ever tried is the answer, because they aren't. We have basis for disinformation in communism and socialism and fascism. We're going to suggest that new structures that have not ever happened are needed. I'm just wanting to say that here so people don't attach to me criticizing capitalism is probably going to suggest something that doesn't work. So the first thing is withholding information. And we see in business how much focus is on IP and NDAs and those types of things. But then it's not simply withholding information, it's also disinforming, right? Just like the poker bluff or the fake left and go right, we have and we can see in warfare, we try and have black projects where we withhold the information because we don't want the other side to know what our military capacities are, but we also try to disinform what our military capacities are, or where we're going to attack, or whatever else, as a source of advantage. And that's been happening forever. Sun Tzu writes about that, right? I mean, it's just, we've had a basis for disinformation for a long time. We've had rivalrous dynamics for a long time. The rivalrous dynamics are a basis by which we can get ahead by war and killing somebody else, or lying to them, right? Or ruining the commons. It's just exponential tech leads to, with those same incentives, leads to exponential disinformation, exponential extraction, exponential pollution, exponentially scaled warfare, and on a finite playing field, that self-destructs. So the underlying cause is the same stuff that's been happening, but at a speed and scope and scale and level of complexity that forces us to have to actually deal with the underlying structures now because they can't continue. Okay, so that's the game theoretic side of it. Now, what would it take to have an intact information ecology where any information that anyone had, just on the truthfulness side, was being shared, that there was no incentive for disinformation? First, let's just imagine that, right? Like no disinformation. Let's give some other examples of disinformation. There's not just where I'm intentionally trying to mislead you. There's also where I'm sharing signal for some purpose for me that might mislead you, and I'm not intending to, I just don't care if I do. So let's say I want some increased attention. And this might be because I'm going to monetize that attention, might be because I'm going to get political power, might be simply because I just want attention, right? So let's say I comment on what some famous person is doing. Let's say I disagree with them. I'm instantly going to get some attention if I critique them effectively that I didn't necessarily earn, and I don't even have to believe the critique because via association of that type, I'm going to get some attention. So now people have a basis to focus on something they weren't focused on before, to criticize it because that will get attention, or to compliment it, or to play off of it in a way that is not actually what they care about or believe. And again, you look at how ubiquitous it is, that kind of phenomenon. All right. So the answer to getting over the truthfulness issue is actually a post-game theoretic world, which is the same answer as like, how do we get past warfare? Well, it's not just kinetic warfare where we throw bombs or rocks at each other. It's also info warfare and narrative warfare and economic warfare, right? Which is basically any in-group that is coordinating to compete against an out-group in some kind of zero-sum dynamic. And that's companies to companies, it's companies to people, it's people to people, it's countries to countries, it's global economic trading blocks with each other, it's all of those things. What can people do right now within a game theoretic world to start to create spaces of truthfulness? Start to create relationships where one of the highest values is truthfulness with other people that are capable of and want and are committed to that, where people are not only not lying to each other, but they are endeavoring to not withhold information, which is tremendous intimacy and tremendous vulnerability. And see if you can create enough psychological safety with some people to be able to start exploring what does it mean to actually share information honestly, so that we can have that and all kind of make sense together. That's one thing. And there's also something where it's like, if you don't throw trash out the window of your car because you don't pollute the environment, be careful about not polluting the information ecology by rationalizing why your own mis or disinformation is okay. And just start to think of it that way. Think of any time you're sharing little lies as polluting the information ecology and being like, oh, wow, I don't want to do that. I don't want to be part of the fucked up information ecology. Okay, so now on the true side, which is not just a mapping or a correspondence between what I'm saying and what I think, but between what I'm saying and what shared reality is, which means there has to be a correspondence between what I think and reality. That means I had to do sense making well before I share something, right? So this is the topic of epistemology. So one is movement past game theory. The next is epistemology. How do we know stuff? So even if nobody was lying and withholding information, the complexity of the world makes epistemology hard. And most people aren't even endeavoring at it. So if no one was lying and I could take all the information as at least truthful, there would be certain epistemic processes that I could apply that I can't apply if I can't even take the sources of signal as being signal without a lot of noise, right? So there's epistemology that I have to have within the context of an of an environment that has a lot of disinformation? How do I make sense of what is true and what isn't true about signal coming in? And then how do I parse from lots of signal what might be true about reality? And for, like, to just get a sense of why, like, how big a deal this is. You take any of the biggest issues in the world, like the issues that could determine whether or not we keep existing as a species. Okay, so take big environmental issues like climate change. There's disagreement as to whether climate change is really even a thing. And to the extent that it is a thing, what the causes are and what the timescales are. Now, most people who believe fervently, no, climate change is real, 97% of climate scientists agree, it's anthropogenic, greenhouse gases, etc. Most of the people that believe that fervently enough to kind of like go into narrative warfare for it have never actually looked at the primary data deeply themselves. And yet there's an almost religious fervor around it that was based on having proxied their sense-making to people who they believe. So the UN said it, or the Gates Foundation said it, or the whatever it is. I've heard it repeated enough times that just through repeatability, like, I have been programmed to believe this thing is true, which is not that different than believing a fundamentalist religious idea, right? And let's say we take people's fervent ideas on vaccines, or their fervent ideas on the viability of market ideology, or almost anything like that. Almost no one who has fervent ideas has a good epistemic basis for the level of certainty they hold. There's a decoupling between how much certainty they have and how much certainty they should have through right process. And then you look at who are they proxying their sense-making to, and most of the time they're not even proxying their sense-making to the people who did the original research, many of whom disagree with each other and were funded by somebody to say something that is not fully true in the first place, and who maybe were employing epistemic biases themselves. But typically it's somebody else who looked at all of that, and then someone else who looked at all of that. So you might have like a bunch of climate scientists into someone who is speaking about that as a climate scientist at a more synthetic level, like a James Hansen or whatever, to then like a Gore or someone who is actually speaking to the public, who we're proxying our sense-making to. And we say, okay, how many steps removed is it, and how good was the original data? And so if we think about, okay, how much radiation actually was released into the environment from Fukushima? It seems like a very straightforward thing. Take a Geiger counter and go out and do the studies. But how many people are equipped to take a Geiger counter out and go do that? Or to be able to actually pay attention to how the flow dynamics in the air and the water are going to work, or, you know, so many things. And so we have to take other people's data to begin with, and those other people, let's say the data was the Japanese government or TEPCO or whoever it was, or a conspiracy theory group that is saying, no, it's actually releasing huge amounts of ocean and all the fish are totally toxified, but they might just be, they have a basis to disinform because they're getting viewership that they're monetizing through that. How the fuck do we make sense of it, right? So what we start to get is, it's like, is AI going to solve a bunch of problems and be relatively safe, or is AI the biggest risk and going to kill us? And you see kind of fervent disagreement, but you see us still pedal to the metal, going as fast forward as we can with AI, and with CRISPR, biotech, and with every type of exponential technology that could be catastrophic. And so there's increasing speed of choice making with decreasing sense making. Right? And so to just think about, like, okay, or even what's really going on with the Chinese government and its cyber warfare relationship with the US government, and with kind of the what its actual capacities are and what its intent and agency is, and those types of issues. Well, we know that's going to be obscured. We know both sides, and all kinds of sides are going to be obscuring information. And it gets even worse, because it's not just that you've got this group of people called China and this group of people called the US, and that they're in a game theoretic relationship with each other, but everybody on Team USA cooperates perfectly, No, of course it's not that, right? So even within the intelligence agencies, I might have two different intelligence agencies that are supposed to be cooperating, but they're competing for a bigger percentage of the black budget. And so they might be withholding information from each other or even disinforming each other. Then I might have two agents within an agency competing for the same promotion who might run disinfo on each other. So I have fractal disinformation, right, at almost every place because of a game theoretic incentive system, which is the balance sheet of countries, the balance sheet of organizations, the balance sheet of all the way down to individual people, right? The separation of agency. So now I'm back to the game theory truthfulness side, but I have to factor that when I'm trying to make sense of things because I have to be able to parse signal from noise to then be able to synthesize the signal. But then, even if that wasn't the case, I'm just trying to do epistemology on good signal. Then I have to say, okay, in a complex system, like where we can't even forecast the weather 10 days out very well, how do I forecast the effect of putting certain kinds of pesticides or genetically modified organisms or whatever into the environment, right? It's a complex system that we can't forecast very well at all. We don't know the tiniest bit of the actual information of how that complex system is going to regulate, but we're going to do stuff that affects those systems at scale. What is the right epistemology to be able to make sense of? Is this a good choice? And so you can see, and what are all the metrics we have to factor? Let's say we're talking about biotech. Okay, so I can give you a drug that is good for some biometric that happens to be associated with a disease that I'm trying to get the doctors to be able to use this drug allowed by the FDA to treat a particular disease. And since the disease is identified by this biomarker, I have to affect this biomarker. So let's say I'm talking about high cholesterol, and so we develop a statin for it. How many other metrics is the statin affecting? Well, every day we're learning new biometrics we didn't even know existed. How many of those are being affected that are part of the unknown set that we don't even know to be able to do risk calculation on? Now, we could say, well, let's run the experiment long enough before we release the drug to see if it affects total longevity and all-cause mortality. Well, nobody fucking does that. Nobody's going to run 100-year experiments on something before they release the thing. They're going to run the shortest ones they can. So where you have a system that has delayed causation, how do I know if that's creating problems way down the road? Well, it does all the time, right? So we get rid of DDT or parathion or malathion because we see that it's super poisonous after we've been spraying it on everybody. And then we bring in a new drug that we also didn't do long-term studies on. I mean, a new pesticide. And then we outlaw it after a little while, and then we bring in a new one. The new ones aren't safer. They just haven't had as much time to show how dangerous they are. So then the question is like, what would the right epistemology be? How many metrics do I have to factor? How do I know how to factor those metrics? What is the total information complexity of the scenario relative to how much the information complexity of the assessment that we've done? So we can get into at some depth the topic of appropriate epistemology for various contexts. But I guess the first thing I can say is that if people aren't even thinking about that, their chance of making sense well is pretty close to zero. If we think about the concept of a meme, the way that Dawkins originally put it forward, it's an abstract pattern replicator, where a gene is an instantiated pattern replicator, which means that it can mutate and change and affect behavior and propagate much, much, much faster, right? And we can kind of say that in Homo sapiens, our genetics selected for mimetics, for higher order mimetics, right? Our genetics, because most other species, what the selective pressures had them be adaptive to an environment, right? There's mutation, and then the mutations that survive and mate the best are the ones that make it through. But that's within the context of survive in that environment and are able to mate successfully in that environment. So they become more and more fit to their environment. So the cheetah does really well in the savannah. It would not do well in the Arctic, and the polar bear wouldn't do well in the savannah, and the orca wouldn't do well outside of the ocean, right? Like, so they are well adapted to their environment. Because of our abstraction capacity, which is both our capacity for language and memes as well as tools, we were able to go and become adaptive, become actually apex predators in the savannah and in the Arctic and in the ocean and everywhere, right? We were able to go to every environment, which means that as soon as our population would normally, if we were any other animal, start to level off in relationship with the environmental carrying capacity of an environment, we just moved. We were able to decimate that environment and move to the next one, right? Into all of them. And then, but that part isn't the part I want to get into right now. It's that since we were going to be adaptive to totally new environments, and since we were going to create tools where what it was to be adaptive was changing, since we modify our environment in ways the other animals don't. We can't come in genetically fit to a specific environment. We have to come in and be able to imprint the environment that we're in so we know how to be fit to totally different environments. Because like, it's not that adaptive for us to throw spears or even climb trees all that well, but it is to be able to like text and drive and stuff that wouldn't have been adaptive 1,000 years ago at all. And so this is why human babies are embryonic or neotenous for so long, right, compared to any other animal. And if you, like, the thing I like to do here is to think about a horse standing up in like 20 minutes and a human being able to walk in like a year. And just think about how many 20-minute segments multiply into a year to get a sense of how much longer we are helpless than anything else is. And even amongst the other primates close to us, there's really nothing like us in terms of the extended helplessness. And that's because we don't have inherited knowledge of how to be us. Since the environment is going to be different, we have to imprint the environment that we're in to be able to be adaptive to environments that we're changing, right? So this is us saying that our genetics selected for neuroplasticity, selected for mimetics, our hardware selected for faster software updates that could have faster changes in adaptive basis so that we could move our environments and all those types of things. So if we think about a meme kind of like a gene as a pattern replicator, but as an abstract pattern replicator that can mutate much quicker, there's also a big difference is that the other animals are, in an environment, the mutation across genes is very evenly distributed. Mutations happening to the gazelles and to the cheetahs at an equal rate, right? And there's co-selective pressures on both of them. So they're both getting faster. The slowest ones of each are dying off. And so there's this kind of symmetry of power that has the competitive pressures between them have them all up level. But when we start being mostly mimetic, and the other species are still mostly genetic, meaning we're getting adaptive based on abstract pattern replicators, they're still instantiated pattern replicators, we can increase our predative capacity much faster than than the environment can increase its resilience to our predative capacity, which means that we can debase the whole substrate that we depend upon, which is self-terminating, right? You can't keep debasing that which you depend upon. So in evolution, there is a selection process for the genes that make it through, right? But there is this kind of symmetry of the genes that make it through because of the evenness of mutation and because of the co-selective pressures. Now with mimetics, the memes that make it through are the memes that win in a rivalrous context, not the ones that necessarily represent the true or the good or the beautiful. So the propagative memes propagate more than the true memes propagate. This is a super important concept to understand, which is, like, I was always dumbfounded thinking about the evolution of religions. You take Christianity, for instance, and you say, okay, so Jesus, when they brought Mary Magdalene, said, let he who has no sins amongst you cast the first stone, right? And then when they're nailing him up, he says, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And he's like bringing forgiveness to Judaism. And in his name, we did the Crusades and the Inquisition and said, we will not just kill, but torture anyone who doesn't accept the Lord of Peace as their... Like, how the fuck did we do that? How did we do the mental gymnastics to take the guy whose key teachings were forgiveness and torture people in the name of that? Well, we figured out how to do it, right? But the key is it was super adaptive. So you've got an idea, right? Say you've got Jesus' teachings, or we can take it in any of them. And then there's going to be a bunch of mutations on that idea, different interpretations of it. Some of the mutations say, be quiet and don't push your ideas on anyone. Like, be contemplative and etc. And those ones don't catch on because they aren't being intentionally propagated. And other ones say, go out and propagate these ideas on missions and on crusades and focus on not the forgiveness parts, but on the like wrath and Leviticus and who God's enemies were, like focus on those parts. And that you actually get better spots in heaven for converting more people, right? And so what you end up getting is that the ideas that catch on are the ones that win in narrative warfare. But they're having to catch on, so then say Islam is also competing for some of the same people, right? Because ultimately the religions become the bases of in-groups that are competing against out-groups for fundamentally political and economic and survival type bases. So I can hold people together with a political left or political right ideology, or a capitalist communist ideology, or a racial identity ideology, or religious ideologies. All of those become the basis of an in-group that can bind together to be more successful in competition with assumed out-groups, right? But what that means is that rivalrous game theoretic environment is going to be selecting for what is effective at rivalry, not what is true. And definitely not what is good for the whole. And the moment that anybody figures something out that is more effective at rivalry, then everybody else reverse engineers it and creates similar mimetic mutations on other sides. And so there's not that many Janes, right? They're lovely people, right? And totally nonviolent and aren't going to hurt anybody, but they're also not pushing their ideas on anybody. So the ideas aren't spreading that fast. So the ideas that have an artificial focus on the spreading of ideas and that figure out how to emotionally manipulate people into believing the idea with heaven and hell and whatever, right, are going to spread more. So this is a key thing to get is, whether we're taking, it's not just, right, I'm giving the example of the teachings of Jesus turning into the Crusades or the Inquisition, but it's also take thinking like Darwin, right? So take the context in which Darwin came about. Darwin came about just following Malthus, right? So we got the British Empire's first kind of real world ruling empire. First time that a global inventory of resources was ever conducted. Malthus came up with the fundamental principle of scarcity or inadequacy. It says, hey, people are reproducing geometrically, resources reproduce arithmetically, there's not going to be enough for everybody, not everybody's going to make it. Well, then who's going to make it? Fuck. That idea says compassion is not viable. We can't all make it. Fundamentally, mathematically, there aren't the resources for it. Now, this is gibberish, actually, today, because we know that populations don't reproduce exponentially forever. They steady state, and we've already seen the population in Japan and in Denmark and in other, like the most economically successful countries, start decreasing, right? And we also know that we can recycle resources. We don't have to just have a linear materials economy where we use them up and turn them into trash. And that completely fundamentally changes the underlying scarcity basis. We can also share resources in different ways. So the underlying thinking behind Malthus isn't true, but he didn't know that at the time. It seemed quite compelling. So then we say, okay, so fuck, a solution for everyone, a world that works for all is not even viable. Those who want it are simply not facing up to reality. And so if not everyone's going to make it, who's going to? And so then Darwin comes out in that context. And so the idea of survival of the fittest is the idea we focus on the most, even though that's not an idea that he emphasized early in the writing hardly at all, right? And so there was, again, taking Darwin's idea in one context and then also taking the most propagated version of it that led to social Darwinism that basically reified institutional sociopathy, right? Which is, okay, well, if not everybody's going to make it, some people are going to be like predators, other people are going to be like prey. Predators don't feel bad when prey die. You have to actually cull the herd sometimes. And if you start to think about how hierarchical power structures work, to get to the top of a hierarchical power structure, like a big corporation or a government or a religion that's structured that way. Let's leave that one off for a moment, just say corporation or government. I have to win at a lot of win-lose games. I have to get the promotion over or win at the campaign over other people. We're zero-sum. Somebody wins, somebody loses, right? So the top is going to be people who are best at winning at win-lose games. So it's actually going to, so if I have a lot of empathy and I don't want, and I actually care about other people's loss, I'm going to do less well. If I'm a sociopath and don't give a shit about it, I'm going to do better at that. If I'm willing to disinform to get ahead, I'll do better at it. So this is why we see higher percentage of sociopaths and psychopaths as CEOs than in the normal distribution of population, which also means that the people who have the most influence in the world are asymmetrically empowered and asymmetrically sociopathic. But the way that we interpreted Darwin was reifying that as a reasonable thing and even a good thing. So we have to recognize that any idea, even if it started as true or good or beautiful, gets put into the game theoretic mill, right? And what propagates is the thing that's propagated. So why do bad ideas catch on? Like, largely for this reason. So oftentimes, the best ideas are not well marketed and aren't even easily marketable. And the best marketed ideas that are going to catch on the most are not that true and produce shitty results. So this is, again, something that people have to really pay attention to is, I think Jordan in one of his interviews with you talked about the difference between real thinking and simulated thinking. So if I'm just taking memes that I've heard and in a conversation and I'm listening for which of the things I'm going to say that I have heard somewhere else, I'm basically a meme propagator. It's not real thinking, right? I'm not actually endeavoring to try to make sense of the world in a new way that I've never done before. Most people hear a meme that comes in, and because it's from Fox, they believe it or don't believe it, or because it's from CNN or whatever it is, they believe it or don't believe it. So they basically have some cluster of memes that creates like a mimetic immune system that says which ideas to accept and which ones to reject, and then once it's accepted them, propagates them. That's not thinking, and there's no sovereignty in that. And groups that have asymmetric meme broadcast capacity are good at making memes that are sticky, customized to specific audiences, and being able to split test uptake, right? And then being able to, then you get into high-tech things like Facebook, and it's like, okay, I can actually pay attention to what you click on and do profoundly deep analytics. I can pay attention to mouse hover. I can pay attention to all these types of analytics and customize the disinformation to everybody using the kind of AI that beats the best chess players in the world at chess, right? This is stuff that Tristan Harris talks about. And so the AI that beats Kasparov at chess easily, nobody is as good at being strategic with themselves as Kasparov is at chess, and we don't even know that we're engaged in that, and yet it's competing with us for our attention for its purpose of maximize time on site. Now, it just happens to be that I'm going to scroll and bounce unless something catches my attention. Short things will catch my attention more because I'm in a hurry. So just the orientation for small bit size makes everyone more fundamentalists with shittier attention spans. And then if the headline is more kind of sensational, it's going to attract attention more. So then we get these big platforms that don't want to make people fundamentalists or drive politics, but they do simply as a byproduct of the fact that limbic hijacks are sticky and they're optimizing for time on site. So first thing is that individual memes don't get selected for. Memes interrelate with other memes to create worldviews, because I usually can't make a choice based on a meme. I have to make a choice based on a representation of the world. It's just going to be a bunch of ideas, right? A bunch of memes, a bunch of data. And so we get these kind of meme complexes. And so we can think about the evolution of meme complexes. So let's go ahead and look at like the evolution of religious ideas. We can look at the evolution of political ideas or anything, scientific ideas. So religious ideas. So you'll have some kind of central meme. But then you'll also have protector memes that emerge with it that also believing them protects against the kind of cognitive processes that could have someone stop believing the primary meme. Because if the primary meme doesn't have protective memes, it won't last. So the question isn't just what makes a meme propagate, but also what makes it endure and resist change. So there's the evolution of memes, but also the meme complex's resilience in the presence of other competing meme complexes, right? So we'll get these protector memes, and then we'll also get propagator memes that are trying to take the whole complex and propagate it. So there's a whole football team of defense and offense and carrying the ball, and right, like that happens. So let's say we look at some kind of fundamentalist religion. So let's say we look at Christianity. This would be the same for any religion. This is just probably the one that most people here will relate to. So you'll have some kind of central doctrinal teachings about Christ and God and what good is and those types of things. But then protector memes are, what could make me not believe these things? And how do we protect against those processes? So if we want to have, say, a literal interpretation, then we don't want people to doubt the literal interpretation. Then we start to have memes like faith is something God likes. And doubt, which is another term for critical thinking, is something that God doesn't like. It actually comes from the devil and you'll burn in hell for it. And so the more that you just believe in the teaching, the better your chances of heaven are, and the more good you are. And the more that you doubt it, the more that Satan actually got to you, right? So that's a very strong protector meme against the kind of critical thinking that could make you question the basis of the religion. You'll also have other protector memes like, if I believe this, if I continue to believe this, I get to keep having a family and a community that will take care of me if I'm poor and if I'm sick, and will help me out in times of warfare and all those things. And if I stop, everybody will disown me, or to various degrees. There will be direct implications to my life regarding the change in these beliefs. And then again, you'll have propagator memes. We need to go on mission and share the good word with other people and convert them. And so you start to see a mimetic ecosystem. So now, if I've got propagator memes coming up against some people who also have protector memes from a previous complex, then there's an evolution, there's a competition of which memes are more successful. So then we look at the kind of evolution of the types of meme complexes over time. Now there are other people that have a lot more expertise in this than I do, and I don't have adequately detailed history to say this is a right historical narrative. It's an example of the type of thing that could happen, right? So take it as that. So say you look at the evolution of the concept of hell, right? Hell is a meme in Western traditions. So first, say you take Eastern traditions like Hinduism or Buddhism, they might have many different hell realms and nobody stays in any of them forever, right? Like most of the interpretations have everybody gets to moksha or liberation. Eventually, these are places that people go to learn things as part of the liberation path. So, and if you look at the descriptions of hell at various points in Christianity, hell got nastier as time went on. And God also got more authoritarian. And heaven got better. And even if we go before that, we look in early cultures and we see most early cultures were animistic, right? The spirit of the buffalo and of the tree and of the river, and there was the spirit of everything. And so spirit was radically decentralized. And then there was an evolution, because of evolutionary pressures on memes that corresponded with little tribes living in nature, to early civilizations. There was an evolution to polytheism, which is now not the spirit of everything, but some smaller number of more powerful spirit or gods, right? So there starts to be a consolidation of power in the religion corresponding to a consolidation of actual power in the social structures that are happening and the way that we make sense of the world and the way that the religious idea actually supports the thing that we're doing in the politics and like that, right? And then we end up going from polytheism to monotheism. And if you think about control systems, right? Some few being able to control a many in ways that are better for the few than they are for the many, and how you have systems of kind of institutional control or oppression. So if we're having consolidation, if we're having increasing power inequality in our social systems, and we want to justify that increasing power inequality, and we want to justify increasing authoritarian power, having gods that reflect that is valuable. Those memes are going to actually be adaptive to the social systems doing that, right? And so if you think about an authority that controls a population with reward and punishment, and then we actually make a god in our image, and we say, okay, well, what would the infinite authority be, and what would infinite reward and infinite punishment? And you just take all the concepts to their logical zenith. That's what Christianity did, right? So you have one all-powerful God beyond reproach with an infinite punishment and an infinite eternal punishment, infinite reward. If you're trying to look for maximum behavior mod, that's what you end up coming to. But it's almost like the strange attractor of a landscape that just takes it to zenith, right? Where it's so terrifying once you've been indoctrinated to leave that belief system, because hell is so bad that any chance of it is so unacceptable that I'll kind of do Pascal's wager and just stay in it just because, right? Now, of course, by believing that, I might be going to the Muslim hell if they're true, but that never got its hooks in me when I was young, so I'm not as afraid of it unless I grew up there, in which case it has the hooks, and I'm much more afraid of that than I am of the Christian hell. So we can see that you get an evolution of the gods getting more powerful and more authoritarian and more propagative and more ideology around propagation and reward and punishment, and like those things that you would expect. Specifically, it's that the groups that instantiated those memes would have actually done better in a natural selection determined in warfare than. And also, if I have a man's dominion over earth ideology that says, yes, destroying the environment for us, and it's okay if we destroy the environment because God's going to come back and remake everything, after purgatory anyways, and treating animals badly really doesn't matter because, again, dominion over. Like, those ideas are actually going to be adaptive in terms of increasing the game of power. Even though if you take to zenith that game, it self-terminates. It destroys the whole world and the substrate that we depend upon. So you want to think about, and we can see that so we're looking at a kind of Christian worldview, right? But you can see that a whole worldview of ideas comes up around supporting Trump, or climate change, or critical thinking and Dawkins' kind of scientific materialism, where each of those worldviews have processes of in-group, out-group pressures, right? Like something bad will happen if you don't believe these things. Going to hell is the worst example, but simply being rejected by the in-group and being called like a stupid conspiracy theorist or a pseudoscientist or an anti-vaxxer or whatever it is or an infidel that goes against whatever the in-group idea is. There's a strong selective pressure to defect on our own thinking to the center of the in-group. And a lot of advantage will occur if I defect on my own sense-making to the center of the in-group. And I don't trust my own sense-making, so I'd rather be part of an in-group where at least I'll be safe by being part of an in-group. And I can't because I can't make sense of the world, and I can't take care of myself really in the present. And it's not safe to disagree with everybody. Right? If I share views that just have me disagree with everybody and I don't have any in-group, then I seem fucked. So what I do is I look at which in-group seems to be closest to what I think, and then I defect on my thinking to normalize with the in-group. Right? So we want to just kind of pay attention to looking at these different information ecosystems, mimetic ecosystems, to seeing how they evolve and to how they apply in-group, out-group types of selective pressures, and how they apply appeal other than good epistemology, right? Like how they apply rhetorical skills and emotional manipulation skills to compel people to believe something where the basis to believe it should actually be some better epistemic process. Then the key thing is if we can start noticing this in ourselves and noticing where we feel a kind of bias towards or away from something before we've thought about it well, based on how it fits with the rest of our mimetic complex that we also haven't analyzed well.